The business class service desk at O'Hare Terminal 3 was packed. Ethan Brooks, in a worn coat and scuffed shoes, told the agent he needed a seat on the 1140. A woman's voice behind him loud enough for 20 people to hear. "You can't afford a ticket on this flight." A few soft laughs. Nobody spoke. Ethan didn't turn around. His hand found the old phone in his coat pocket, then left it there. He only smiled. In just over an hour, she would make the call herself, the one that left her unable to say another word. 9:41. 6 minutes earlier, Ethan Brooks had come through the north doors of Terminal 3 with a paper ticket folded in his hand. He still printed them. In an age when everyone held up a glowing screen at the gate, he carried a slip of paper and in the other pocket, a flip phone he had refused to replace for 8 years. The hinge was cracked. The battery lasted 4 days. People who saw it assumed he couldn't afford better, and he had long ago stopped correcting them. The terminal ran hot at that hour. Rolling bags, coffee lines, gate announcements folding over one another. Ethan moved through it without hurrying the way a man moves through a place he has walked 1,000 times. At the security post near the escalators, a heavy-set man in a uniform looked up and stopped mid-sentence. Robert Ellis had worked that post for 30 years, all of them under contract, to the airline that ran the terminal, and he knew the face immediately. He took a half step forward. Ethan shook his head. Barely a movement you would miss if you weren't watching for it. Robert settled back on his heels and gave him the same short nod he gave every passenger who came through his line, and that was the end of it. Robert had seen the man in that terminal maybe a dozen times over the years, always alone, always in the general line, always with the same bag. The first time Robert had stared for a full 10 seconds before he trusted his own memory. He had never said the name out loud in the building, and Ethan had never asked him to keep it. It had simply become the arrangement between them. Ethan's father had worn a uniform like that. 22 years of night shifts at a warehouse on the south side, coming home at 6 in the morning smelling of cold concrete, sleeping until 2, doing it again. He had never once been thanked by name. Ethan had grown up understanding exactly what it cost a man to be invisible in a room he was responsible for. The flip phone had been his father's idea of a joke years ago, a cheap thing bought at a drugstore and handed over with the observation that a man who could be reached anywhere would never be left alone anywhere. His father had died before the joke got old. Ethan had replaced the battery 4 times and the phone not once. His phone buzzed against his chest as he passed the currency exchange. The message was 3 lines long. The Dallas board meeting had been moved up to 3 o'clock. Weather out of the west, 2 directors flying in early, the agenda pulled forward by 2 hours. He did the arithmetic standing still in the middle of the concourse. His 1:20 flight landed too late. There was one flight that worked the 11:40, and it was already inside the window where seats stop existing. There were people he could have called to fix it. That was the part he did not like to think about. He could have made one call and had the seat and the meeting and a car waiting at the other end. He had built a habit out of not doing that, and the habit had cost him flights before. He turned toward the business class counters and caught his own reflection in the glass of a closed newsstand gray coat worn at the cuffed shoes he had owned for 6 years, a suitcase with a strap gone soft from handling. When he was 23, a man in a burgundy jacket had walked him out of a hotel lobby in Milwaukee because he did not look like a guest. It had been raining. Ethan had stood under the awning for 40 minutes waiting for the person he was meeting, and when the man finally arrived and shook his hand in full view of the front desk, nobody apologized. He had thought about that lobby for more than 20 years. He had also, somewhere along the way, decided he had come far enough that it would never happen to him again. 2 escalators away. Vivian Hale came through the doors at a pace that made other travelers move for her. She had run Halloran and Hale for 9 years, and in 9 years, she had never wanted anything as badly as the meeting waiting for her in Dallas that afternoon. Ground transport for an entire airline network, 400 jobs on her side of it, 3 nights of 4 hours sleep, and a face she had fixed in a car mirror on the way to the airport. Her assistant, Rachel Delgado, was half a step behind with a laptop bag on her shoulder and bad news she had been holding since the parking garage. The 1:20 arrival wouldn't clear security in Dallas in time. If they didn't get on the 11:40, they would walk into that room after the decision was made. Rachel gave her the number in the car, and then again on the escalator, hoping repetition would make it land differently the second time. "There's a seat," Vivian said. "There is always a seat." Rachel didn't answer because the honest answer was that there was one and someone else was already standing at the counter asking for it. Counter 12 was the only one open with a short line. Behind it, Naomi Reed had been on the job 5 months and was working her third early shift that week. 20 feet down the counter, her shift manager, Gregory Lane, was walking the row with a tablet, checking on nothing in particular, the way managers do when the morning is going well. Ethan reached her first. He set the paper ticket on the counter and said he needed to move to the 11:40, that his meeting had changed, and that he understood it was late notice. Naomi typed. Then she looked up with the small, bright expression of someone who gets to give good news for once in a morning. "There's exactly one seat left," she said. Ethan thanked her and reached for his wallet. It was an ordinary transaction with about 90 seconds left in it, and if it had finished, none of the rest would have happened, and Naomi Reed would have gone home that night with nothing to remember about the morning. Vivian arrived at the counter 40 seconds later. 40 seconds. That was the whole margin, and it was the part she would not be able to accept. She heard the last 3 words of what the agent had said, and she looked at the man standing in front of her to understand what she was up against. She was not a cruel woman, and later she would spend a great deal of time on that fact as though it were relevant. She was a tired woman who had been told no twice already that morning and had 400 people's payroll running through the back of her head like a faucet nobody could shut off. The coat, the shoes, the soft strapped bag. Her conclusion took less than a second, and under 3 nights of no sleep it came out of her mouth before any part of her had a chance to stop it. "You can't afford a ticket on this flight," she said. 2 men in line laughed. A woman near the stanchion looked at the floor. A teenager with headphones took one earbud out and left it hanging, and the whole area arranged itself into an audience without anyone deciding to. Rachel Delgado, standing just behind her, felt something in her stomach turn over. She had worked for Vivian Hale for 3 years and had never heard her say anything like it, and the strangest part was how ordinary it had sounded coming out. Ethan didn't answer. He was thinking about a sentence his father used to say when he came home in the morning still wearing the uniform. Nobody read the name tag on "Your worth is not in other people's eyes." His father had said it the way other men say the weather without any weight on it, which was probably why it had stayed. What happened next was the part that mattered. Vivian turned to the agent, and her voice changed into something reasonable and administrative. "Are you certain he qualifies for business class?" she asked. "Check it again." Naomi's hands came off the keyboard. Not far. 2 inches, maybe. But they came off, and the screen sat there with a booking half finished on it. That was the moment the thing stopped being a rude remark and became a procedure. A remark can be ignored. A remark passes, but a request to check again goes into a system, and systems do not care who started them. Ethan had 3 options, and he knew all 3 of them the way a man knows the exits in a room. He could argue, which would prove nothing to anyone who had already decided. He could take the phone out of his coat and end the entire thing in under a minute. Or he could stand there. He chose the 3rd one, and it was not because he was above the other 2. It was because a question had opened in him that he had never been able to answer honestly. He had spent years being told the room had changed. He had a title that made rooms change around him. But the title was in his pocket, invisible, and for once, he was standing at a counter as nothing but a man in a worn coat. He wanted to know how far it would go. He took his hand out of his coat pocket and left the old phone where it was. 30 feet away, Robert Ellis had stopped walking. He had heard the sentence. He knew what he was looking at, and he understood that the head shake from earlier meant something different now than it had at the escalators. People picture prejudice as something loud, a voice with an edge in it, a face that has made up its mind and wants you to see it. Most of the time, it is quieter than that. It is arithmetic done in half a second, an old suitcase, a pair of shoes, a face, and a conclusion reached before the first greeting has a chance to be spoken. The danger is not in the arithmetic. Everyone runs it. The danger is being so certain of the answer that checking it starts to feel unnecessary and then acting on it anyway. At counter 12, Naomi's hands were still off the keyboard. The clock above the departures board read 9:52, 13 minutes until the priority change window closed. There is one thing far easier to check than another person's paperwork, and it is the thing we forget how we treat them while we still don't know who they are. Naomi Reed's hands came back to the keyboard, but not to the booking. "Sir, could I see your membership card, please?" Ethan took it out and set it on the counter without comment. It was plain worn at one corner, the kind of card that gives away nothing at a glance. Naomi ran it through the reader, and the reader did what it did 4 or 5 times a day. It thought about it. The little light blinked amber, then amber again. Behind him, Vivian Hale let out a breath through her nose, and the 2 men who had laughed earlier heard it, and one of them smiled at the floor. "See," she said. It wasn't loud this time. It didn't need to be. Naomi pulled the card out and ran it a second time, and the amber light held, and the woman in line took that as an answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. 20 feet down the counter, a man in a gray suit stepped past the stanchion and set a leather bag on the scale at the position that had been closed all morning. Gregory Lane came off the wall with his tablet, opened the position for him, and had him tagged, checked, and pointed toward the escalator in about 40 seconds. He never asked for a card. He never asked for anything but a last name. The man in the gray suit said thanks and was gone, and it was such a small piece of business that nobody watching would have thought about it at all, except that it happened 4 feet from a man who had been standing still for 11 minutes. Ethan thought about it. Vivian raised her hand slightly, the way people do in restaurants, and Gregory came over. She didn't order anything. That was the part worth noticing. She leaned in a little, dropped her voice into the register people use when they are being helpful, and made it sound like she was doing the airline a favor. "I think this one should be verified properly," she said. "Not making a fuss, just for everyone's safety." Gregory Lane had been a shift manager for 6 years. He had a wife, 2 kids in middle school, and a performance review in November, and he had learned that the fastest way to make a problem disappear was to agree with whoever was making it. He looked at the woman in the tailored coat, and he looked at the man with the soft-strapped suitcase, and he made no decision at all, which was itself the decision. "Of course," he said. "We'll take a look." He came around behind Naomi and reached past her shoulder to the flag key on her terminal, and he did not read a single line of what was on her screen before he pressed it. "Manual verification," he told her. Naomi's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Sir, the seat's on a hold. Manual takes 20 minutes minimum. Then it takes 20 minutes." She looked at the screen. Then she looked at the man on the other side of the counter who had not raised his voice, had not argued, had not done one single thing since he arrived, and she typed the code that took his booking out of the fast line and put it into a queue where a person she would never meet would open it whenever they got to it. The system asked for a reason. There was a drop-down. She scrolled it twice and chose the vaguest thing on the list because none of the options said what had actually happened. The clock over the departures board turned to 10:05. Somewhere in a server, a window closed. The priority change window on flight 1140, the one that would have let an agent move a passenger onto a departing aircraft with 2 keystrokes, expired the way it expired every morning, quietly and on schedule. The last business class seat on the 1140 went from held to available. Vivian Hale stepped forward and bought it in 90 seconds, with a card she didn't have to explain. There was 1 seat, so she bought it for herself and told Rachel to get on whatever came next and meet her there. Ethan watched her do it. He did not move. That was the moment his silence stopped being free. Up until then, standing still had cost him nothing but time, and time was a thing he had a great deal of practice giving away. Now it had a number attached. The meeting in Dallas started at 3. There was no other flight that made 3. Every minute he stayed quiet from here on was a minute he was actually spending, and he knew it, and he stayed quiet anyway, because the question that had opened up in him at 9:52 had not closed. Naomi kept working. She had 4 people in her line and a screen full of other people's mornings, and she got through 2 of them on autopilot. Then she did something she was not supposed to do. She reopened Ethan Brooks's record in a second window while a customer was talking to her, and she read the top line properly instead of skimming it. And she stopped. The status field showed the highest tier the airline issued, not the one you get from flying a lot, the other one. The company affiliation field was blank, which she had never seen before, and the account had a service note on it that she did not have the clearance to open. She looked up. Ethan was already looking at her, and he shook his head. Barely. The same movement he had given Robert Ellis at the escalators 40 minutes earlier, and it meant exactly the same thing. Naomi closed the window. She would think about that headshake for a long time afterward, the fact that he had chosen it, and that she had gone along with it, and that both of them had believed for about 20 more minutes that going along with it was the decent thing to do. Vivian, boarding pass in hand, could have walked away. Her seat was bought. Her afternoon was solved. The rational thing was to go find coffee and let the morning close behind her. She didn't, and she couldn't have explained why, and the truthful answer was the one nobody says out loud. The man had not reacted. He had not gotten angry, had not gotten flustered, had not conceded anything. He was standing there in his worn coat, being perfectly calm, and every second of that calm sat in her chest like an accusation she hadn't been charged with yet. So she turned back to Gregory Lane. "I'd like you to call your duty manager," she said. "There should be a record of this." Gregory did not want to call the duty manager. Calling the duty manager meant an incident number, and an incident number meant his name on something that outlived the shift. He said he would see to it, and then he went back to his tablet and saw to nothing, the way a man puts off the one task he knows he will regret either way. Out in the concourse, the phones had come up. It started with the teenager with the headphones who had been holding his at waist height for a while, and finally stopped pretending. Then a woman near the stanchion. Then a man who moved 4 steps sideways for a better angle and didn't care who saw him do it. Nobody was laughing anymore. The 2 men who had laughed at the beginning had drifted away without a word to each other, the way people leave a room when they realize they're in the picture. The mood had changed twice. First from indifference to curiosity. Now from curiosity into something harder, the tight, alert quiet of a crowd that has understood it, is watching something go wrong and has not yet decided whether that's their business. Robert Ellis had closed the distance. He was 10 feet from the counter now, hands folded in front of him, standing the way he had stood at that post for 30 years, and he had not spoken one word since 9:41. He had been told not to. That was how he understood the headshake, and he had spent 30 years respecting the difference between what he was asked to do and what he wanted to do. But he had stopped moving away. At 10:28, Gregory Lane made the mistake that ended his morning. Nothing had gone away. Vivian was still there. The crowd was still there. And Gregory, wanting all of it out of his terminal, walked over to the security officer standing 10 feet from the counter and said the sentence that would be read aloud in a conference room 8 days later. "I need you to escort this gentleman out of the business class counter area." Robert Ellis looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him. He did not shake his head this time. "Sir," Robert said, and he said it slowly, the way a man says something he has already decided to say, "I don't see any grounds to remove a passenger with a valid reservation from a public area of this terminal." Gregory blinked at him. "It's a courtesy area." "It's a ticket counter," Robert said. "He's got a ticket." And then he stood exactly where he had been standing, and it became clear to everyone watching that he was not going to move, and that there was nothing in the building that was going to make him. Something turned over in Vivian Hale for the first time that morning. It was not the refusal. People refused her. She was 52 years old and had built a company out of hearing no. It was the way it had been said. A security officer 2 years from a pension had just declined a direct instruction from a manager in front of a crowd and 12 phone cameras, and he had done it without heat, without hurry, and without the faintest trace of a man taking a risk. Men that age do not take that kind of risk for a stranger, which meant he wasn't a stranger. She did not follow the thought all the way down. There was still a version of the morning in which she was right, and she was holding on to it with both hands. At 10:30 on the other side of the terminal check-in for flight, 11:40 closed. Vivian Hale had a seat on that aircraft. Ethan Brooks had a booking in a manual verification queue and a paper ticket for 120 that was now worth nothing at all. He understood something. Then standing at a counter he had helped fund the renovation of, and it was not what he had expected to learn. He had come into that terminal half believing that the worst thing in a room like this was a person with a bad idea in their head. A person like that can be argued with or outlived or simply walked around. But no single person had done this to him. Vivian Hale had said one sentence and asked one question. Everything after that had been done by people following procedure, a manager who agreed, an agent who typed a code, a drop-down menu with no honest option on it, a queue, a window, a clock. The machinery had bent itself around one woman's half-second assumption and then reported that it was operating normally. That was the thing worth being afraid of, not the prejudice, the paperwork that stands up and salutes it. In that whole room, the only person who had said anything out loud was the one with the least to gain and the most to lose. The sentence had been heard by 20 people. 20 people had known it was wrong. 20 people had understood immediately and without effort that a man was being treated badly in front of them. And 20 people had gone back to their phones. What makes an insult land is rarely the insult. It is the silence that follows it, the shared and comfortable agreement of everyone within earshot that this is not their business. Injustice almost never requires many participants. It only requires enough people to hold still. Gregory Lane went back to the terminal in the office behind counter 12 at 10:36. He had been humiliated in front of a crowd by a man in a security uniform, and he wanted a piece of paper somewhere that said he had followed procedure. So he opened the incident report he had promised 20 minutes earlier, and the form asked for a passenger name because the form always asks for a passenger name, Ethan Brooks. He hit submit at 10:37 and thought no more about it than a man dropping a letter into a mailbox. Rachel Delgado had been holding still for 50 minutes, and she hated herself for it in a way she would not be able to put into words until much later. She had stayed a step behind Vivian's laptop bag on her shoulder because that was the job. She had watched the card go through the reader twice. She had watched the man in the gray suit get his bag tagged in 40 seconds. She had watched her employer buy a seat out from under a man who had been standing at the counter first, and she had said nothing because saying something to Vivian Hale in public was not a thing that happened. Then she heard the agent say the name. Naomi had it on her screen and read it aloud to the manual verification line when they finally picked up the way agents do, spelling it out. Brooks. B as in Bravo. Ethan Brooks. Rachel knew that name. She could not immediately say why, and the not knowing bothered her enough that she set the laptop bag on the floor, crouched, and opened it right there against the base of a stanchion. The Dallas file was 300 pages. She didn't need 300 pages. She needed the appendix, the one she had built herself 6 weeks ago at 11 at night, because Vivian liked to know exactly who was in a room before she walked into it. Meridian Air. Board of Directors. 7 names. She scrolled. The 4th line took the blood out of her face. She read it twice, and then she read the paragraph under it, the one she had typed with her own hands about which directors had voting influence over the ground transport recommendation, and she felt the floor tilt very slightly under her heels. She stood up too fast. The laptop was still open in her arms. Ms. Hale. Her voice came out wrong, too quiet and too urgent at once, and Vivian, who was watching the security officer who would not move, did not turn around. Not now, Rachel. Rachel stood there holding the answer to the entire morning against her chest, 4 feet from the only person who needed to hear it, and was told to wait. That was the whole story in miniature, and she would understand it later. The truth had been standing right beside Vivian Hale the entire time, and Vivian had chosen not to hear it exactly the way she had chosen not to look at a man for longer than half a second. At 10:45, Naomi Reed made a decision. She had been thinking about it since she closed that second window. She was 5 months into a job with a probationary period that ran to 6, and she knew precisely what she was risking, which is why what she did next was not an accident or a moment of feeling. She opened the record. She cleared the manual verification flag with an override code she was authorized to use and had never used. She restored the booking, and because the check-in window had closed, and the only remaining path was a gate override, she printed a boarding pass and pushed it across the counter with 2 fingers. "Sir," she said, "you can still make it if you go now." Ethan looked at the pass on the counter and did not pick it up. Gregory Lane's tablet chimed. "Override codes generate alerts. That is the entire point of them." He came down the counter fast. He read her screen over her shoulder, and then he did the thing that would end up in a conference room with a lawyer present. He did it right there, not in an office, not in the back. At the counter, in front of the crowd, in front of the phones, in a voice pitched for the whole area. "You've overridden a manager flag," he said. "You're off the floor. Give me your badge." The room went very quiet. Naomi did not argue. That was somehow the worst part. She unclipped the badge from her collar with hands that were not working properly and set it on the counter next to the boarding pass she had just printed, and she got her jacket from the hook behind her, and she came out from behind the counter. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at anyone. She walked past 12 phones with her chin up and her hands shaking, and went down the long corridor toward the staff door, and the sound of her shoes was the only sound in that part of the terminal. Gregory took the boarding pass off the counter and voided it. Ethan Brooks watched a 24-year-old woman walk away down a corridor with her arms held stiff at her sides, and he was 23 years old again, standing under a hotel awning in Milwaukee in the rain, waiting 40 minutes for a man to arrive and shake his hand in front of a front desk that never apologized. He had spent more than 20 years telling himself that the lesson of that afternoon was patience. Standing there at 10:49 in the morning, he understood that he had learned the wrong lesson from it and that he had been teaching it to himself ever since. At 10:52, the gate agent at B11 closed the door on flight 1140 to Dallas. Ethan felt it happen without needing to see it. He had spent enough of his life in airports to know the shape of a departure. Somewhere out on the ramp, a jet bridge pulled back from an aircraft carrying a seat that had been sold to a woman in a tailored coat bound for a meeting he was not going to attend. He found that he did not much care about the meeting. He had made a rule when he was young and kept it for 20 years, and the rule was that he would never use what he had to get what he wanted, because the day he did, he would become one more man who got things because of who he was rather than what he had done. He had been proud of that rule. He had kept it at real cost more than once, and he had thought of it as a kind of spine. But the rule had just been paid for by somebody else. He had stood still to protect his own dignity. That was his right. A man can spend his own dignity however he likes. He had not asked and could not have asked, and had never for 1 second considered whether he had the right to spend hers. Nobody had put a price on his silence until a 24-year-old woman walked down a corridor holding her arms stiff at her sides. Kindness costs something, and the one who pays is almost never the one who was helped. That has never once made it the wrong choice, only a choice that asks for more courage than most people are told in advance. Ethan Brooks stood up straight. For the first time in 70 minutes, he reached into the chest pocket of his coat toward the old flip phone with the cracked hinge that his father had bought at a drugstore as a joke. It rang before his hand closed around it. The ring was small and cheap, and entirely wrong for the room. A drugstore flip phone with a cracked hinge going off at a volume that belonged to another decade in a terminal that had gone so quiet You could hear the escalator running 40 feet away. Every head that had been turned toward the corridor where Naomi Reed had gone turned back. Ethan opened it and put it to his ear. He listened for about 10 seconds. What he said took less time than the listening had. "I'm still in Chicago." He listened again. "No, I didn't make the flight." The voice on the other end went on for a moment, and whatever it offered, he cut through it without raising his voice at all. "Send someone down," he said, "and bring the personnel file for Counter 12. He closed the phone and put it back in his coat pocket. There was nothing dramatic in any of it. That was what unsettled the people standing closest. A man in a worn coat had answered a cheap phone, said 4 things, and hung up, and somehow the temperature of the whole area had dropped. Incident reports that mention removing a passenger from a service area do not sit still. Gregory Lanes had gone up the chain from Chicago to the corporate desk that handles anything with legal exposure attached, and at 10:50 it had reached the chairman of Meridian Air's board sitting in a conference room in Dallas, beside an empty chair, wondering why one of his 7 directors had not called about the change of time. He read the passenger name and picked up the phone. Vivian Hale had asked for a manager to be called. She had, with her own insistence, set in motion the one call in the country capable of ending her morning. Ethan turned around and she was standing 8 feet away. He had assumed she was gone. Minutes earlier, he had felt the 1140 push back from the gate and had pictured her in the seat she'd bought taxiing out toward the runway. But she had not moved from that counter since 9:42. She had stayed to see it through, stayed to be right stayed, while her own boarding pass expired in her hand. Winning had cost her the flight, and she had not noticed until the phone rang. At 10:55, 4 people came out of the service corridor and crossed the floor. They did not run. Somehow that was worse. Nobody who saw them come across that terminal ever described it afterward as hurrying. They described it as the way people move when they have already been told exactly how much trouble they are in. The one in front was the airline's regional operations director. He had a folder under his arm and a face like a man walking into weather. He stopped in front of Ethan Brooks and put out his hand. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I'm very sorry we left you standing here for over an hour." 10 feet to the left, Robert Ellis came to attention without being told, to the way a man does when 30 years of a job move his spine for him. Rachel Delgado closed her eyes, and Vivian Hale, who had spent an hour building a version of the morning in which she was right, watched that version come apart in a single handshake. She knew the name now. She had known it for 4 minutes and had refused to look at it. Ethan Brooks was one of 7 votes on the Meridian Air Board, the board that would sit down in Dallas at 3 o'clock and decide whether 400 jobs at Halloran and Hale had a contract attached to them. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had not in 50 minutes said one unkind word to anyone. One phone call had done all of it. She did not apologize. That is the part people always get wrong about moments like that one, the assumption that shame arrives first and clean. What arrived first was defense. "I never said anything about race," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which encouraged her. "I asked a question about a procedure. That's all I did." Ethan did not answer. "Anyone in my position would have asked," she went on. "I had 400 people depending on that meeting. Anyone in my position would have asked the same question." He still did not answer, and the silence did what silence does, and she reached for the third thing, the one she actually believed. "If you had simply said who you were at the beginning," she said, "none of this would have happened." "That one," he answered. "You're right," Ethan said. "If I'd said who I was at the beginning, none of this would have happened." He let her have that for a moment. "The problem is that I shouldn't have had to say anything at all." He looked past her at the counter, at the empty stool behind it, at the badge still lying where a 24-year-old woman had set it down. "And the man who stands here tomorrow?" he said. "The one with nothing to say? What about him?" Vivian Hale had no answer to that, and the absence of one was the first honest thing that had happened to her all morning. That was the moment she actually broke not 4 minutes earlier when she learned who he was. Learning who he was had only told her she had picked the wrong man. The question about tomorrow told her the man had never been the point. Ethan turned to the operations director. "The first thing," he said, "is that you call Ms. Reed back, now." The director looked at the folder under his arm, which held, among other things, the personnel file he had been asked to bring. "Sir, there's an override violation on the first thing," Ethan said again, and that was the end of the discussion. They found her in the staff corridor by the break room, sitting on a plastic chair, with her jacket still on and her phone in her hands, trying to work out how to tell her mother. Naomi Reed came back onto the floor 11 minutes after she had left it in front of the same crowd and the same phones, and the operations director handed her the badge himself and said the word reinstated loudly enough for everyone to hear it because Ethan had made it clear that it needed to be heard by exactly the people who had watched her walk away. She clipped it back on her collar and could not get her hands to be steady, and she looked at Ethan for the first time since the head shake, and he gave her a small nod that meant something entirely different from the last one. Gregory Lane was not fired that morning. What happened to him was slower and considerably worse. He was asked to sit down in the office behind counter 12 and write out, in his own words, the grounds on which manual verification had been initiated on a passenger with a valid reservation and a top-tier membership card, the specific factual basis with the time it was requested and the name of the person who had requested it. He sat in front of a blank form for 20 minutes. He could not write a single line, not because he was hiding something, because when he looked for the reason honestly, all the way down there was nothing there but a woman in a tailored coat leaning in and saying it should be verified properly, and himself agreeing because agreeing was faster. Ethan crossed the floor to where Robert Ellis was standing. The two men had known each other in the way they knew each other for 11 years and had exchanged perhaps 40 words in all that time. Ethan did not add many to the total. "Thank you for not doing it," he said. Robert nodded once. He looked as though he might say something about 30 years or about pensions or about the difference between an instruction and an order, and in the end he said none of it because it was all fairly obvious to both of them. Ethan came back to Vivian Hale last. She was standing where she had been standing, holding a boarding pass for a flight that had left without her. Behind her, Rachel checked her phone and said quietly that the Dallas meeting had started, and Vivian gave no sign of having heard it at all. The thing she had wanted more than anything that morning had begun 3 states away without her, and she could not make herself care while she was still standing at that counter. "What I need isn't an apology to me," Ethan told her. "It's respect for whoever is standing at this counter, including the ones who don't have a phone call to make." He did not fly to Dallas. There was a 240 with seats on it and a car that could have met him at the other end, and the operations director offered both twice. Ethan declined both. He took the board meeting at 3 o'clock on a laptop borrowed from the airline's own duty office, sitting in a row of gate seats at B11 with the same worn coat on and the same soft-strapped suitcase at his feet, while travelers walked past him without a second look, which was the only part of the day that felt normal. The ground transport recommendation came up on the agenda at 4:20. What Ethan Brooks said about Halloran and Hale in that meeting never left the room. He did not raise the morning. He did not raise the name. 7 people discussed a contract on its terms and moved to the next item, and the decision when it came weeks later and quietly. There are people who will tell you he should have buried her. He had the votes and the standing and every reason in the world. He had watched what happened at that counter when someone used their weight to settle a personal thing, and he had no intention of being the second person to do it that day. Status can make a room listen to you once, but what changes the way that room treats the next person who walks up to the counter, the one with nothing in his hands and no name, anybody recognizes, is something else entirely.